One of the scholarly arguments for the origins of Yahweh is that the deity of that name isn't part, or may not have been part, of the Canaanite pantheon, but originates further south, among the Kenites, near or outside the lands of Midian, and possibly even in the Arabian Peninsula. There are a number of prominent scholars who hold to this position, and we explored in another episode the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis with regard to the origins and triumph of Yahweh. There are also a number of prominent scholars, it must be stated, who also reject this idea. We need not worry about those arguments here, because this series on the origins and triumph of Yahweh specifically look at the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis, and here we're examining how this would affect our understanding of Genesis, in particular, the story of Adam, Eve, the Garden of Eden, and their expulsion from that garden. The documentary hypothesis of the Torah and the larger Hebrew Bible holds that the Old Testament is an editorial composition of many differing and different documents, oral to written traditions that were eventually brought together during the period of the Josiah reforms, which culminated in the centralization of temple worship in Jerusalem. This explains the priority of the temple and the emphasis on Jerusalem as the central focus of Yahweh and Yahweh's will interwoven within the Old Testament text. Part of the documentary hypothesis sees Genesis as having multiple strands, and in the early chapters of Genesis, the two most famous sources are the Yahwist and the priestly source. The Yahwist source is older than the priestly source, as indicated by the use of the name Yahweh. There is also the Elohist source within Genesis, but the Elohist source is not in the early chapters of Genesis. The early chapters are a composite of the Yahwist and the priestly source. Genesis 2:4b through Genesis 3 is the Yahwist account of origins. Genesis 1 through the early verses of Genesis 2, prior to the Adam and Eve story, is considered part of the priestly tradition, and we know this through a careful study of the language used in the early chapters of Genesis. Genesis 2 and 3, however, tell a very interesting tale, especially in light of the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis. If Yahweh, the name of God in Genesis 2:4b through Genesis 3, originates as a god of the nomadic tribes around Midian, or the Arabian Peninsula, a god of wanderers, then the story of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from the garden serves as the origin myth, the origin story of the wandering peoples who worship Yahweh. Furthermore, the oasis-traveling Midianites come out of the desert, and that would have been a positive, and that would have led to having a positive mentality of gardens, despite the fact that they continued to wander from oasis to oasis. And within this, you can also see an implicit desire to belong to a garden paradise by a people who have been expelled and forced to travel from garden, to wander the desert. Because Yahweh isn't part of the Canaanite pantheon, according to the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis, then the origins of Yahweh naturally belong elsewhere. If the origins of Yahweh begin outside the Canaanite mythos, which belongs to a sedentary, agrarian civilization, and is indeed found among the nomadic wanderers, if Yahweh is found among the nomadic wanderers and not the sedentary and agrarian Canaanite civilization, this, of course, will alter one's understanding of the Edenic Genesis narrative. After all, it is Moses' meeting with the Midianite Jethro where the name Yahweh reappears in the Old Testament text during the theophany of the burning bush, and later in Exodus 6, where God reveals his name as having been El Shaddai to the Abrahamic patriarchs. El was a Canaanite deity, the chief deity of the Canaanite pantheon. Yahweh's origins and whether or not Yahweh was part of that pantheon, again, is unknown. But if Yahweh, as the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis asserts, is found outside of the lands of Cana and originates with the Midianites, we begin to see why there is an emphasis on an expulsion from a garden, but why a garden paradise still has a certain allure to the people who must travel and wander from oasis to oasis. The story of expulsion, exile, and wandering that Genesis 3 ends with fits with the Midianite hypothesis from a psychodynamic perspective. Given that the Midianites were nomads, the fact that their ancestral lineage in Adam and Eve is based in exile provides the genesis of why the Midianites are a nomadic people. Yahweh decreed it so for the transgressions of their ancestors. Further, this explains why the Midianites cannot stay in the oases that they encounter in their nomadic journey. Each and every single oasis is a remnant of Eden, from which they cannot remain permanently attached to. And then there's also the simple geographic fact and the environmental reality of it being impossible for a desert oasis to contain the large groups of traveling Midianites as they move from place to place. After all, the continuation of the Adam-Eve narrative with Cain and Abel reflect Midianite nomadic themes. Abel is a shepherd, a nomadic wanderer, like the Midianites. Cain, who murders Abel, is likewise sentenced to expulsion and becomes the mythic father figure of the Kenites, who bear his name, or at least that is the etymological argument. The Kenites, who were coppersmiths and iron workers, the task that Cain and his descendants end up taking after his expulsion, join with the Israelites in the conquest of Canaan. That's found in Joshua 1. And the association of Yahweh as a God of conquest with the Israelites who achieve hegemony over Canaan begins. While the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis, as mentioned, is not universally accepted in biblical studies, the plausibility of the idea, backed by the archaeological and etymological data, gives new meaning to reading the Genesis narrative of Eden and after Eden. If Yahweh does in fact belong to a nomadic and wandering tradition of people, then it makes sense why Adam and Eve are expelled to a wandering exile, and why their chief son within the Genesis 4 story, Abel, is a shepherd and a nomad. This is, of course, the very life and the existence that the worshippers of Yahweh live. It doesn't make sense for an agrarian theology to take an anti-agrarian origin story for its theological beginning. Now, one might say that there are commands to till the ground and that the garden does have agrarian connotations, but that fails to recognize that one would also have an implicit and soft agrarian reality as travelers and nomads moving from oasis to oasis. You see some elements of an agrarian tradition mixed very strongly with an exile nomadic shepherding tradition, which predominates and takes greater prominence within the narrative precisely because the people, the Midianites, are a nomadic tribe, moving from place to place. They are shepherds, they are wanderers, they are in exile, moving from oasis to oasis. never able to fully embrace that agrarian garden life that they were supposedly expelled from in their mythic beginnings. Thus, the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis also informs the editorial redaction of the Drusian reform. The Yahwist tradition, coming from the older Kenite-Midianite Edenic tradition, gets ingrafted into Israelite religion, as the biblical text also seems to imply. It gets stitched into the Genesis narrative with the Canaanite patriarchs and the priestly synthesis to provide a complete synthetic origin for the Israelite people. Again, the book of Genesis includes the priestly and the Elohist source traditions. The priestly source of Genesis 1 through 2:4a provides a new synthetic origin story to Genesis 2:4b through 3 and 4, which likely comes from the Kenite-Midianite ingrafting into the Israelite tradition. Because after the Adam and Eve story, we move straight into the patriarchal story of what will become the Judahite narrative, leading to the formation of temple worship in Jerusalem. The priestly and Josian redactors, seeing the Kenite-Midianite Edenic tradition as offering the earliest account of origins, therefore gets placed where it did, before the priestly editors provided a preface, so to speak, with Genesis 1 and Genesis 2, 1 through 4a. Thus, if the Kenite-Midianite hypothesis is true, as its proponents claim, we begin to see and make sense of the Eden narrative. It is the story of how a wandering and nomadic people, the Midianites, ended up being a nomadic, exile, wandering people, because that is what happened to their ancestors in the mythic past. Adam and Eve were expelled from the garden and forced to wander the lands, moving from place to place, just as the Kenites and the Midianites do.